And I'd ask Dr. Michael Ross to make his statement for 3 minutes, please. Dr. Ross.
For 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. So my name is Michael Ross. I lead a research program at Yukon University that's directed by the electric power utilities in the territories. So what that means is I look at and investigate renewable technologies, novel technologies to meet our industry's needs. But in a lot of ways, what I've been focusing on is the integration of renewables into remote communities across the north, focused on Indigenous communities on their renewable energy projects. And ultimately what I have found is, with regards to the integration of renewable energy technologies, it's never siloed. We have to consider many different aspects. And I like to use the STEEP framework to identify the considerations of integrating renewables into remote communities. It's the STEEP framework, where we look at the social, technical, economic, environmental, and policy aspects of integrating renewables. With regards to the social aspect, I mean, that's what government is for, is to look at the best interest of people. And the integration of renewables can lead a lasting legacy and the sustainability of these remote communities if it's established properly. For the technical aspect, that's my bread and butter. I'm an electrical engineer. It's utilities' prime mandate to provide safe and reliable power to their customers. And when power systems are 4 nines reliable, 99.99% reliable, everybody just always assumes that you could throw anything at it and it will always work. Whereas that's not always the case, especially when power has to equal power at all times. When you integrate intermittent resources like solar and wind, where you can't tell the sun.
Excuse me, Dr. Ross. We're having trouble with interpretation, I think.
If we can't tell the sun to shine or the wind to blow, it's hard for the utilities to provide safe, reliable power to their customers when they don't have as much controllability. So if we reduce our reliance on diesel fuel, which is a proven technology that's dispatchable and easy to control, we just have to supplement that with additional resources and capabilities to provide those ancillary services for a safe integration. There's also the economic aspect of it, which impacts the business case and how much ratepayers pay for their electricity. The environmental aspect, I'm of the opinion that you can't extract energy from an ecosystem without affecting that ecosystem. It's just a matter of different resources have different impacts on the environment. And then finally—
Excuse me, Dr. Ross, I apologize for these technical difficulties.
Report, you now have 3 minutes. Excellent. Thank you very much to members of the committee for having us today to talk about the strategy on clean technology. I'm Vincent Moreau. I'm Executive Vice President at Écotech Québec. I've been here 3 years. We're an industrial cluster that is involved in clean technology in Quebec, innovators, investors, companies that want to adopt clean technology. We're talking about accelerators and incubators. So we accompany that ecosystem to facilitate the deployment of solutions that can protect the environment and fight climate change. The second thing we do is influence public products. We believe in the power that clean technology gives us to start that ecological thing. We're thinking of companies that look to small suppliers and ask them to adapt to standards, be it sustainable financing or environmental targets. So it'll have an impact on the whole supply chain. We're having an ecological transition that is necessary to fight climate change in Canada. Now, we have many recommendations. There are 3 things. First of all, we have to support small and medium-sized business that are innovative to allow them to continue research work and their deployment activities. That's the first thing. We can do this in different ways, improving programs. It can also be via tax credits or other fiscal measures. I'll discuss that during the questions and answers. Then improving existing programs, having them get more rapid access to these programs, easier access, and accelerate their deployment. We want to implement the largest number of projects possible. So you have to have rapid access to these programs while improving them and have good harmonization between the various programs in place. Third thing is to give incentives to industry who want to accelerate, who are there, who want to get involved in this adventure, and give them incentives through other measures, and give those to other companies to benefit from these programs by giving them targets or standards to adopt clean technology that will have an impact on the fight against climate change and the protection of the environment. This can be done in many different ways. I can give you many examples about these recommendations through accelerated amortization. They can also be able to protect their intellectual property, tax credits, R&D tax credits. Mr. Moreau, I'm sorry, we've just gone over the 3 minutes.
Bonjour, my name is Jeanette Jackson. I'm the CEO of Foresight Canada. Honored to be here today. Foresight is Canada's largest clean tech accelerator, and our audacious goal is that Canada be the first G7 country to reach net zero. And we can do this by effectively bringing together innovators, industry, investors, academia, government, and Indigenous communities in strategic, thoughtful ways to rapidly launch, commercialize, and scale clean tech solutions from Canada. We have a passionate team of 35 staff, 170 global executives that support 3 key pillars of activity around acceleration, adoption, and ecosystem alignment. I'm happy to discuss some different program details as required. Tackling climate change takes collaboration. With our partners and networks, our programs have helped more than 850 Canadian companies validate, commercialize, and scale. 150 global partners source Canadian clean tech. And our venture network has created more than 750 green jobs, 7,050 green jobs, $1.2 billion in investments, and driven more than $2 billion economic impact for Canada. We also do investor matchmaking and curate about 1,000 introductions per year to strategic investors. We applaud the Government of Canada's efforts to position Canada as a global leader. Other countries are catching up in some areas around investment and policies in adoption. The biggest challenges and opportunities for Canada are in every sector. Every sector is impacted, and we have a very dynamic landscape of sectors and competencies across the country. This will, if we work together, lead to unprecedented economic and social well-being opportunities through investments, exports, and attracting the best minds in the world, as well as preserving our resources. I wanted to showcase a few strengths, in particular, clean tech across different value chains. Forestry, we're talking about engineering wood, biomaterials, bioenergy, and packaging. In mining, mineral processing, ore sorting, battery electric vehicles, zero-emission vehicles for large industry, and of course, lithium production. Energy and carbon management, things like CCUS, hydrogen, methane, renewables, processing of those technologies and ores, and of course, utilities management. Transportation, things like batteries, fuel cells. We have these competencies. We cannot look over waste management and built environment. Those are up-and-coming aspects of excellence in Canada. And water is often an unlooked at segment because you don't calculate it by GHG, you calculate it by saved water. And in Canada, we are also building competencies around data and digital clean tech, AI, some manufacturing, and carbon credit management solutions. So if you want to become a global center for financing clean tech, let's look at the finance sector as well. We have innovation gaps in these value chains, in particular around manufacturing and scale, and it is important to keep in mind that companies still are moving from Canada to closer to adoption as well as capital. So the opportunities we have on the ideation stage, let's make sure that we're giving industry information to academic institutions and innovation hubs so that we can be more problem, market, and data driven. Happy to dig into that. On the commercialization side, this is why we've launched some of our programs around technology acceleration. You really need to know how to commercialize technology and allow ventures the tools they need to use engineering firms and other sources without feeling insecure about their IP.
Thank you.
Great opportunity there. We have engineering strengths across the country.
Thank you.
Am I done already? 3 minutes?
Yeah,
Woo!
3 minutes.
And when we talk about moving towards net zero in Canada and around the world, what we're talking about is an energy transition. And one thing that SMIL says is this: all energy transitions have this in common. They are prolonged affairs that take decades to accomplish, and the greater the scale of prevailing uses and conversions, the longer the substitutions will take place. Right now in Canada, only about 7.4% of electricity was generated by wind and solar or biomass. Given the complexity and difficulty of energy transitions, whether it's from wood to coal, coal to natural gas, etc., why is the pace of this transition in Canada moving so slowly?
I'll start talking a little bit. We'll kick it off and hopefully not offend anyone. Certainly, in certain countries outside of Canada, they have been more bullish on policies where certain fuels in certain applications are no longer accepted. But those economic environments are quite different than Canada's economic environment, where we do rely on that sector to fund a lot of non-energy related programs around social services and other pieces. So Foresight, we are supporting both those regions that would like to go aggressively and go straight to green hydrogen, but we also understand some sectors are needing to take a more thoughtful approach. Something that I would like to see, and Foresight's been championing, is a bit of an energy decision tree, so we can map out where it makes sense for hydro, biofuels, hydrogen, based on some economic drivers in different regions, or some outputs or waste energy materials, biofuels and things like that in certain heavy industry regions across the country, and that might accelerate that pathway for industry who are perhaps not able to flip a switch. But in certain situations where there's more low-hanging fruit, I think we could be more bullish. Retrofits and stuff are nice, but even with cement, there's still a lot of great companies that are doing net zero cement that can't get into the sector. So energy is a big piece, but I'm cognizant of the importance of that sector for other intentions.
You mentioned cement. So, and I've heard of net zero cement being developed in countries. I was in Sweden, and they talked about that. What's the impediment to that adoption here?
We have great companies like Carbon Cure and several others that sell outside of Canada. It's the policies in the building across municipalities. So if it's not embedded in the specifications, then it's just too complicated for the engineering firm approving the project, or even engineers within those communities, if it's a municipal buyer, or getting a project approved within a jurisdiction.
Is it also because of cost?
Actually, most of the projects now are becoming cost comparable. You might pay a small premium, but once you start to factor in carbon tax, you got to do a holistic analysis.
Right. Well, so I'm glad you brought up the carbon tax. Okay. So the carbon tax is in Canada. It's been running for a number of years. Emissions have gone up in Canada every year since the carbon tax has been implemented. So would you say it's been an effective tool to reduce carbon emissions?
I am not a carbon tax expert. I do believe the carbon tax creates a framework to collect dollars to invest in programs that will accelerate the net zero transition. I think it has an effect in certain ways beyond the money to get people to start thinking and acting. So yes, now numbers from a per capita perspective, we're monitoring that. We'd like to see Canada be the first G7 country. Consumer behaviors and other things could also be invested in. So, yeah.
Did anybody else want to take a stab at that question? Or I'll move on to another question.
Monsieur Moreau, vous voulez répondre à la question?
Mr. Moreau, did you want to answer that question? Mr. Moreau, I saw your hand up, didn't I? You lowered your hand. We're talking about why the energy transition couldn't happen faster. These are public practices that have to be put in place to accelerate this transition, and there are places where we could have substitutions of fossil fuel with renewable energy, and there are other places where we require research. The clean technology does exist to accelerate that research in order to invest in companies that have solutions. For example, in the industrial world, We could replace natural gas with hydrogen for certain procedures. So I think that public policies have a great role to play. We need fiscal incentives, tax incentives, in order to have results and incentivize investments. And we could have the carbon exchange, such as we have in Quebec, and that can be quite effective. But once again, we have to implement all programs with accountability and require a contribution to this transition.
Government programs, do you think the tax credits and other incentives that the government offers for investment in clean tech, do you think those are sufficient to speed up the energy transition?
Very briefly, please, we're out of time, but go ahead.
Oui, c'est jamais assez.
It's never enough. There has to be synergy between existing programs and add that to solutions today applicable tomorrow.
Questions. I have a motion I'd like to put on the table, and I hope that you can find unanimous consent for it. That the motion reads as follows, that the clerk of the committee be authorized to grant access to the committee's digital binder to the offices of the whips of each recognized party.
Is there unanimous consent to consider and adopt this motion? I see heads nodding. Congratulations, Mr. Longfield,
Well,
on the adoption of your motion.
Thank you to my colleagues and the whips behind us that are supporting all of us. Whatever we can do to help the whips help us is great. I'd like to direct my first question to Ms. Jackson, and thank you for your presentation. 3 minutes does go quickly. I wanted to follow up on your connections with innovation centers across Canada. I know you have a partnership with Innovation Guelph, one that's near and dear to me, and working with women's entrepreneurship through Innovation Guelph. The connections to Calgary, other innovation centers that we have in Canada, as well as the Clean Growth Hub we have in Ottawa. And now the Clean Growth Hub is in place to try and help to foster innovation and look for the barriers to adoption that we've already been talking about in the committee this afternoon.
Sure. So Foresight as an organization, we are national. We often work with over 20 different organizations in different regions and sectors, including associations, to provide a pillar of support around acceleration. So companies that they're interested in learning more about, getting them further along in their commercialization pathway, and on the adoption side, so running innovation challenges for industry. So Innovate Guelph, Climate Ventures, Platform Calgary, Innovate Edmonton, they're all we're all connected and looking at clean tech and climate and how we can make the acceleration of clean tech development faster. The Clean Growth Hub has certainly been a great portal. They seem to be convening thoughtfully different groups to try to get them to collaborate and share information. And I think most importantly, sort of transfer knowledge from all the different ministries on what they're doing and interested in clean tech, whether it's funding buckets or events or initiatives, and trying to get that sort of translated down to all the regional groups. So that would be our biggest engagement with the Clean Growth Hub.
Thank you. And the Clean Growth Hub has put out a report that they were audited and reporting back on improving communications to get better contact with the proper applicants, people that would be applying for things that they can support through the Clean Growth Hub. Have you had any experience with what works or doesn't work with Clean Growth Hub? I know this isn't your thing, but as a customer, maybe.
Well, we as an organization don't use the Clean Growth Hub for our own funding. That was not an option for us. It's really about venture services. And it's interesting because each ministry also has a portal for specific programs in their ministries. So it depends. Some like I'll give an example, Pacifican, they have the BSP program and a few other things. Most of the companies in that province go directly to that Pacifican outlet. But, obviously I do think there's a communication function and a portal management function for where you can apply for funds.
Thank you. And they don't do direct funding, but they do the connections, as you said. Thank you for that. I want to go to Mr. Moreau. Really good to have your testimony from Quebec. I know that the Quebec government provincially has been a large supporter of Ecotech, and you've had good success working with the provincial government. Could you maybe mention the work with the federal government, and where are the opportunities for the federal government to help with your organization?
Thank you for your question. I will say it in French. It will be better for me and shorter also. So
we cooperate with the government of Quebec to accompany companies to have that green transformation and improve practices. So with the federal government, we would like have better links and better support. That's one of the recommendations we have, is to improve financing for liaison agents like us that bring together all the actors, venture capital and whatever, and have more linkages. When it comes to resources to accompany these companies, transmission will happen faster and faster, and there will be incredible need. The federal government would have an opportunity here to accompany not just us, but organizations like ours throughout Canada that are liaison between companies that have needs and companies that have solutions, the researchers and the funding. We're also part of...
Interject, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I also noticed that you're working in New York City with the Smart Cities Connect Challenge, and I'm thinking that there might be some international opportunities that the federal government might be able to help with as well.
yes, that's true. On collabore beaucoup avec...
We cooperate a lot with Canadian agencies. How do we call this? Offices outside Canada to facilitate exports and throw a light on the solutions out there, the whole Canadian network situation. Is Canada investing enough, in your opinion, on innovative locomotives, such as Quebec companies involved in this field? Second question, your organization certainly identified obstacles to the full potential of clean technology companies in Quebec, be it delays in delivering financing programs and subsidies, etc. What are the obstacles identified by your organization, and have you identified solutions to surmount these difficulties? Yes, thank you very much for the question. I can't answer that in 6 minutes, but I'd be pleased to send you what we've discussed and the obstacles we've identified. But quickly, in a nutshell, there are billions of dollars indeed to favor adopting green technologies, but this has to be directed and harmonized properly. We have to make sure there's accountability to ensure the impact of these investments and programs, to make sure that we're really protecting the environment and contributing to the fight against climate change. The innovation sector has many solutions. Some have difficulties in getting the financing needed. When you're talking about public-private partnerships, you have 75% public contributions, but that 25% private contribution is very difficult to find. How could we get this with mixed financing? By giving municipalities the possibility of being considered private contributors, because this will happen on their territory. There are many solutions like that. There's also the regulatory aspect. We have to accelerate the approval process to have access to programs. If it takes 6 or 9 months to get the money, for a very small company, a startup, that's too long. So often you have 1.5 years or 2 years to get financing and put that technology to work and market it as fast as possible. So the programs have to be accelerated. They have to be adaptable over time, because what's relevant today may not be relevant in 2 or 3 years. The programs have to be flexible. I could talk about this all afternoon, but I will send you our recommendation. It's used a great deal abroad, internationally. What would be the advantages for Quebec and Canadian companies to use a portal similar to that, to yours, to Radar portal or other portals of this type? Well, we have a project in course. We want to build something for an entrepreneur looking for something, but who doesn't know what exists. With portals like this, they can be accompanied about the issues and the needs they have, and they then be referred to the right clean technologies, the right innovations in order to act more quickly and take action. So when we build tools like this at Écotech, we always think about accelerating the adoption of clean technology and helping companies take action by being a link. Thank you very much.
A number of my questions were directed towards Dr. Ross, so maybe I'll just read out a few of them so that, Dr. Ross, you can send some answers in writing. And I was looking forward to hearing from you in particular because it's so important that we support northern, rural, Indigenous communities in the transition to clean energy and reducing diesel consumption. And so this summer, I met with some amazing researchers who are doing projects in BC supporting Canada's off-grid communities, the majority of which are Indigenous, and focused on wind, tidal, and wave energy. It's the Pacific Regional Institute for Marine Energy and Discovery. And I'd love to hear, well, at least get in writing, a description of some of the socioeconomic benefits of independent power production in northern and Indigenous communities, and really how important could renewable energy be in the context of local economic development and benefits for rural Indigenous communities. And then maybe I'll direct a few questions to the other witnesses. There's been a number of really interesting comments, and first, maybe to Ms. Jackson, based on your experience, what do you see as the biggest barrier facing renewable energy and efficiency technologies in Canada?
Renewable energy? So literally solar and wind?
Renewable energy.
Or broad spectrum, that technologies that aren't as mature?
I would say technologies that are going to get us to our goal of net zero.
Because on the wind and solar stuff, it's a capital problem and a commitment problem. So some of the barriers, I think I'm going to echo what Mr. Moreau said. Thankfully, I was listening, where it's really about the ability to have innovation sandboxes where regulatory and even capital structures to finance these types of projects are given a little bit more leniency. Again, even some education, like a lot of the major consumers, including municipalities, aren't aware of how they can leapfrog by looking at a blend of different renewable sources so that they can start to move the needle in that direction. So it's education, it's policy and permitting structures. They take too long, 6 months, 10 months, 12 months. By that time, someone is onto a new idea, right? And then, of course, education on what's possible and what an actual energy structure to support that community can look like. So that would be some of my comments. Not sure my colleague. Say hi to Denis for me as well.
And Mr. Moreau, I know you have answered this in part in previous, but if you have anything to add.
Oui, je vais dire bonjour à Denis.
I'd like to say hi to Denis. There's one thing we have to think about. When you're talking about an energy transition, of course, yes, there are renewable energies, but there's also the whole issue of energy efficiency. We're great consumers of energy here in Canada. Yes, there are technologies that will allow us to apply energy efficiency today, but there are others that need to be financed. There are accelerators, incubators, or agencies like ours that can help us make sure it goes all the way to companies that can apply them. Let's not forget that energy efficiency is part of the solution too. It depends on public policy, requirements, standards, and incentives, and follow-up to see if it's efficient later.
In terms of, I really love, Ms. Jackson, your goal of Canada being the first G7 country. Can you give some examples internationally of countries who are doing it right, and what could Canada be doing better following some of those examples?
Sure. So one example right out of the gate would be Denmark. I think they're usually one of the most prolific examples where they've just mandated renewables and they've mandated some reflection on future investments in projects that aren't on a pathway to net zero, infrastructure and other things like that. When we do our cluster development strategies, it is a lot of regions that have more consultation in place. So they give capacity like what Ecotech's doing. We do that in different regions as well, where you're bringing together the stakeholders in municipalities to say, hey, look, what does your energy structure look like? What does your climate impact look like? How can we map out a pathway and then bring in those existing solutions or new technologies, and then bringing in the industry and the investors to actually invest and get those things going. And some regions that are effective on that, I mean, quite frankly, Lytton is an interesting example now, having to rebuild from ground zero. You're almost a blank canvas, right? So you don't have all those other barriers. I think it'll be interesting to watch them. In South Africa, there is a really interesting government program where to attract capital into projects, not just equity capital or debt capital, but investing in projects that have a business case. They actually give sort of a kickback and a tax break based on the number of green jobs created, and of course the actual calculated GHG reductions.
Thank you.
70 collaborators that you have that are working with your group. You have 35 staff. I'm interested in some of the types of groups that are working for you, and I say that from this particular context. It doesn't matter what it is that we're trying to build and what clean technology we have, unless we measure it from the first shovel that we use to dig it up to the last shovel we use to cover it up, then we're not having a fair assessment. And it doesn't matter whether it is hydro dams, whether it is windmills, whether it's solar panels, whether it's oil and gas, hydrogen, all of these things have to be taken into consideration. And then to take a look at what the impacts of what the CO2 issues are going to be if that still remains one of the issues that we have. Can you give a quick, I know 170 is quite a few, but can you give me just some of the highlights, people that actually understand and realize that those are important metrics?
So yes, it's quite a list. We engage with folks in the ecosystem in a few different buckets. One would be certainly policy leaders. We're not a policy expert group, but working with folks like Clean Energy Canada and Pembina and all those groups to understand sort of what they're putting forward, which will include finance tracking and metric counting and standardizing that, if you will, across different industries. We work a lot with engineering firms whose job is to quantify the impact of a project, should it be implemented, and we're understanding, can we get them ahead with the clean tech companies so that they can help the clean tech companies really communicate what impact they can have that's validated and tangible for buyers. On the municipality side, we do a lot of innovation matchmaking with municipalities. I'd say where they need support, and is something that I'm championing, is a net zero integrated marketplace where it's kind of tried and true tested policy specifications and technologies that can be rapidly deployed, and then we can work on that next funnel of technologies that aren't quite ready yet. Yes.
Because one of the things that I believe Mr. Seebeck had spoken of are the gatekeepers that we have in municipalities, and because they haven't quite got their head around how it is that they want to have any kind of industry in their communities. And of course, these are one of the things that concerns me. If you take, for example, building an electric vehicle battery, it's 1,000 pounds. It takes 500,000 pounds of earth that has to be moved to make that happen. You don't do that unless you've got hydrocarbons there in order to make that occur. So that's what I'm speaking of when I say we need to measure all aspects of it, because some of these great ideas, I love science, I love the way it can be done, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it is going to get the results that we have. So that's one of the parts. And the other concern that I have, and you mentioned forestry, and how important it is, and how they're able to change, how they're able to kind of find their way in the renewable industries. Agriculture is the same, and it hasn't been mentioned there. And of course, we fear that the measurements and the things that have happened in agriculture are not being considered. We know the whole concept of nitrogen fertilizer has nothing to do with anything other than the fact that it comes from natural gas. So therefore, if you want to cut down on the use of natural gas, then you have some blanket statement that says that we need to get rid of fertilizer or reduce fertilizer. So do you have agricultural groups that are in your collaboration network?
10 seconds, please. Unfortunately,
we have an AgriNext program. It's a national program in partnership with different associations across the country, farmers who are on the job trying to figure out what climate's going to look like to them. So we're pulling information and looking at...
investing in clean tech alone will solve the climate crisis, that we don't need price on pollution, that we don't need regulation or anything else, that all we need really is to increase clean tech. And while I agree, clean tech is vital for reaching net zero, I remember my grandmother always saying to me, necessity is the mother of invention. And I'm wondering from our witnesses today whether you could comment on kind of the supply and demand side balance between having the price on pollution and investing in clean tech, and also what signals it sends to investors when people hear investors in clean tech, when people hear questioning whether a price on pollution or some of these regulations or mandates are actually necessary, what kind of impact that has in this arena.
Oh, mine's red, so I'll go first. So the two things, I'll definitely lean on consumer behavior. You're absolutely right. People make what people buy, and I think we are missing an opportunity to really educate consumers on their buying habits and consumption. Obviously, you can't control it, but education could perhaps go a long way. And then in terms of investments and industry investments and other private capital investments, it's based on confidence in a market, right? So the reality is that in 99.9 cases, most VCs and large investors looking at that $130 trillion that's going to be deployed over the next 27 years, they're going to want to see confidence in the markets, confidence in policy, confidence in tax structures, and confidence that, at least for the time being, that carbon credits will be a factor in the business models that will allow them to invest.
Thank you. And I was just earlier today, in fact, with some other members here, we were listening to the special trade envoy from New Zealand. And on agriculture, she was talking about the fact that there were mandates put in place for reductions in methane for farmers in New Zealand, and that they were getting absolutely no government assistance for any clean tech or anything else, that they were very proud of the fact that they were undertaking these changes on their own, and they felt that it was their responsibility to do this. So there are models where there are only mandates and requirements or prices on pollution being put in place without the support. How important do you think, though, that support for clean tech is in reaching those targets?
Very briefly, we have 10 seconds.
So I believe that supports are required. I do think there needs to be more flexibility. There's a lot of buckets, and each of them, if they're a little bit more flexibility with fewer buckets, I think you might see better resolve. And in Holland, very similar thing. They allow each farm to have its own wind farm and feed that back into the utility. And so there's flexibility in other aspects for them to make up funds on the climate side to feed into those other.
We talked briefly about the importance of research for the development of clean technologies. We've also talked about technologies like solar power that are innovations. I wouldn't say we see them daily, but quite frequently, and wind power. However, there is one form of energy that I heard a lot about a few years ago, and I almost never hear about anymore. I was wondering why. That's geothermal energy. What we heard in the past, this would be a solution, especially in the far north. Has research been sufficient on geothermal energy? What is putting brakes on that as a source of energy for Quebecers and Canadians? There you have it. That's for Mr. Moreau. Mr. Moreau, I'm not an expert in geothermal energy, but there is innovation. that still happens in vertical or horizontal geothermal energy. There are innovators in our province. I would say that it's not that people aren't as interested, it's a matter of infrastructure available. There's a challenge with our built environment to have that migration from fossil fuel to other types of fuel. Another form of energy that I'd like to shed light on that we don't hear much a lot is biomass. Forest as well as other forms. That's an immense form of energy, even in isolated areas where they don't have access to Hydro-Quebec or other energy suppliers. Are you asking someone else? Ms. Jackson, 30 seconds.
I thought you were going to talk about fusion and nuclear, so that's interesting. Same thing, infrastructure costs, and there's a few sites that have been defined that could deploy geothermal. The rest of the research, and Mr. Ross, I think, would probably be the most...
And I wanted to follow up, Ms. Jackson, you had mentioned Lytton, which, made me think about the just devastating impacts of the climate crisis and how flooding, climate fires, extreme weather is impacting this transition as well. So I'm curious if any of the work that you've done has looked at how increasing extreme weather events interacts with this transition to a low carbon economy. I'm thinking in particular our electricity grids, but if you have any other thoughts.
Well, sometimes we're so focused on the here and now that we forget about the importance of adaptation and resiliency. So certainly in BC, fires and floods. I've spent some time with some different groups across Europe that are doing a lot of making a lot of investments in adaptation, peat moss, and a whole bunch of other opportunities we have to really lean in on our adaptation and resiliency innovation and business models that make it make sense. So yes, I think it's nice to do. I think the model, both with Ecotech and the work that Foresight does from an accelerator and adoption perspective, given some capacity, it should be factored in to the whole opportunity analysis around Cleantech. We have a lot of companies that do it, and we just funnel them into the Cleantech category just so we can get them supports. But there's certainly an opportunity to be more diligent, and I think insurance companies and other folks might want to weigh in and perhaps even invest in some of those actions as well. But we need a starting point and capacity to do that type of work.
And maybe just opening it up to Mr. Moreau, if you have anything to add, if any of the companies that you're working with, or if there's any kind of interaction between that clean tech development and the impacts of the climate crisis.
Okay.
We have many companies working on energy efficiency who will accompany companies that have energy challenges, who want to get rid of oil or diesel. We do have them, and there are many companies that come and see us to call on innovators, to look at the ecosystem of innovation. Who are the suppliers out there? Ecotech does some support that is essential to this ecosystem. If we can improve that and accentuate that.
We've heard a lot about the so-called valley of death in the clean tech industry. There is a lot of money being spent on the research and development of clean tech, but we hear a lot of this technology is failing to meet commercialization, to be commercialized. My question for Mr. Moreau and Ms. Jackson, what would you recommend the government do to support commercialization of clean tech technology in Canada?
Mine's read first, so I guess I'll speak again first. Interesting perspective from someone like myself who runs an accelerator. I think we need to be very honest with ourselves what type of team value proposition, business model, and competitive advantage a venture has, because if they do check a certain number of boxes, they will get capital. So it's sort of the next tier where they're missing one of those factors, and that's where accelerators like us come in. You don't want to disrupt a company who's already on their pathway, but if a company can't quite get it, let's be honest, what do we need to have them show to really recommend government programs, lean in and make those investments that'll have a higher probability of success. So we do a lot of work with our programming to weed out, but yeah, I'm going to use the term, weed out who really has those boxes checked that we think. And now remember, there's always, regardless of what company you look at that's successful, they're going to pivot along the way. They're going to learn on the way. There's no perfection. But if we have platforms that are rigorous and market data and problem driven, then I think the supports that follow will align with that. So certainly on the project funding side, that's a little trickier. I would say the investment needs to be more on domestic adoption opportunities, and those companies in the that have a perceived valley of death will win through procurement efforts as opposed to having to worry as much about the venture side. So two-sided marketplace.
Mr. Moreau, you have anything to add to that?
Oui, je compléterai en disant que...
Yes, I would add that we have to complete the funding of entrepreneurs that trying to be more mature and so that they can get to the marketing stage. The financial framework is always difficult in order to get all the way to marketing, in order to get through all the approval stages, approvals and standards. I'd say that there's additional funding that should be targeted because innovation has to meet a need. Ms. Jackson explained that well. But that capital venture and all that is there. There's money available. But if that whole financing phase could be completed in order to get all the way to commercialization, that's what's necessary. A lot of companies don't get there because they're missing that little push that is not huge in financial terms, but it is essential.
Thank you. At the last committee meeting, I asked the department about their Clean Growth Hub. The hub acts as a one-stop shop for federal clean tech programs. However, when I asked the department how many clean tech projects that received government funding reached commercialization, they stated, and I quote, "The hub does not collect information on the number of projects that reach commercialization state after receiving government funding." Do you believe that it would be useful for the government to know how many clean technologies reach commercialization?
So we do annual surveys and quarterly surveys, so we actually have all that data, a lot of that data. Data is important. It's important to know who's winning, who's doing what, and I do think making decisions and offering program based on data is important.
Mr. Moreau?
Je crois aussi que c'est important d'avoir cette donnée.
I think it's important to have that data. A number of innovators are looking for financing, and those that are accompanied, well, how many are marketed? I think that's important information to have, too.
And, you mentioned the importance of attracting investments into clean tech. How can we create a more investment-friendly environment for clean tech in Canada?
You have about 10 seconds, so I'm sure you know the answer. You've been working in
I think tax incentives to attract more private capital.
Versus Canada. Canada is one of the top 10 hydrogen producers in the world, with 3 million tons of hydrogen produced annually. So my question, Ms. Jackson, to you, and then Mr. Moreau, I'll certainly circle back once Ms. Jackson is finished. First question is, how did Canada become a leader in hydrogen technologies?
Well, for anyone to become a leader, usually there's a scenario where there's waste hydrogen. In this case, waste hydrogen, and people were figuring, okay, how do we collect it and turn it into something valuable? And that is my understanding of where the starting point of hydrogen innovation came to light. And then when they're figuring out, okay, where can you actually apply the hydrogen, that's where more innovation happens on the demand side. And so on specific manufacturing, production, industrial sites, hydrogen is an output of the process, and that's where a lot of the innovation has come from. Now we're looking at non-industrial site hydrogen production within communities and such like that. So usually there's just an environment, some waste product, someone has to turn it into something valuable, and boom, you've got...
Dr. Christina Hoicka, Canada Research Chair in Urban Planning for Climate Change, and Francis Bradley, President and CEO of Electricity Canada. I think there's some problems, some login problems for Ms. Andrea Kent from the Renewable Industries Canada. So we'll go to opening statements from Dr. Hoicka and Mr. Bradley for 3 minutes, please. Dr. Hoicka.
Hello, thank you for having me here. My Canada Tri-Council funded research focuses on renewable energy transitions for communities in Canada and on nearly every continent. Canada can reach its 2030 targets to uphold its pledge made to the UNFCCC that are only 8 years away if we follow the evidence on our fastest, cheapest options that also improve social and economic benefits in a socially and economically just manner. Critical and technologically viable options for decarbonization include electrification of transportation, deep energy retrofits to buildings, the rapid introduction of heat pumps, and the rapid scale-up of waste heat capture for heating and cooling processes in cities and industrial districts. To do this, we need to quickly scale up renewable electricity generation, new distribution and transmission technology to get this renewable electricity to where it's needed. Peer-reviewed research shows that over at least 50 years, public and private sector funding for research, development, and deployment for nuclear and fossil fuels have been orders of magnitude more than funding for renewable energy and energy efficiency in Canada. If we spent on renewables the way we spent on these, we could direct financial, regulatory, knowledge, and administrative resources towards our best possible pathway of meeting both 2030 and 2050 targets. A dramatic increase of renewable energy is possible if there have been technological advances. For example, renewable energy has become the cheapest option on the market, including compared to coal. Combining renewables and adding flexibility like load balancing and demand response can reduce the cost of storage. According to the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development and the International Energy Agency's Energy Technology Guide, there are at least 38 technologies that include a range of renewable energy technologies that are market ready and could be scaled immediately with the right supports. According to my own research, Canada is not supporting these proven technologies to the extent needed to reach our climate goals. Supports for renewable energy and reducing energy demand should focus on increasing the supply of renewable energy as a critical opportunity for local economic development and socioeconomic benefits for rural and Indigenous communities that can develop renewable energy to export out of our regions and into cities to support the rapid uptake of electric vehicles and heat pumps. Addressing the electricity grid and developing and implementing innovations that reduce the congestion of energy demand in cities. Research and development of new materials and innovations to address the supply of critical rare earth magnets and metals, removing regulatory barriers and improving the economic, regulatory, and administrative supports to improve the utilization of these innovations.
My name is Frances Bradley. I am the CEO of Electricity Canada. Electricity Canada is the national voice of electricity in this country. Our members produce, transport, and distribute electricity to industrial, commercial, and residential clients from coast to coast to coast.
It is Canada's energy future, and it's a key economic, environmental, and social enabler essential to Canadian prosperity. The sector employs over 100,000 people and contributes over $30 billion to Canada's GDP. It's also among the cleanest in the world, with more than 80% of Canadian electricity already being produced from non-emitting sources. Electricity itself is not a new technology. The first arc lamp was switched on in front of the Davis Hotel in Winnipeg in 1873, making it the first record of electric light in Canada. Even though electricity may be an old invention, let's not make the mistake of thinking that it's no longer innovative. In fact, electricity has been at the forefront of technological innovation throughout its history and will remain so, particularly as the world seeks to reduce emissions and move towards a greener economy. Ultimately, emissions reduction is about finding innovative ways to power economic activity with cleaner technologies. Electricity is the nexus between emissions reduction and clean technologies. Our sector is either an adopter of or an enabler of the clean technologies that will help us reach our climate goals. Electricity is a clean technology, and with the appropriate support, it has the potential to fill most of our energy needs and pave the way towards a net zero future. Now, what do I mean by appropriate support? Getting to net zero will require massive investments in our electricity systems, transportation, home heating, and industrial processes that currently use some sort of fossil fuel will increasingly be electrified. Even where direct electrification isn't practical, such as with some heat-intensive processes or heavy transport, alternative fuels like hydrogen can be produced using electricity. To reach our net zero targets, electricity will need to become Canada's primary energy source. The federal government has projected that Canada will need 2 to 3 times as much clean electricity by 2050. To do so, Canada will need to lean on all available options, including more renewables, traditional hydro and transmission, but also emerging technologies such as small modular reactors, carbon capture, energy storage, and hydrogen. Balancing all of this alongside affordability and reliability will be a monumental effort. 4,851.
Thank you.
That is the number of days before the end of 2035 when the government has committed us to be net zero. It's not a lot of time, and to meet the needs of tomorrow, Canada needs to start building today.
Looking at some of the costs of this, RBC put out a report. It's called the $2 trillion $2 trillion path to net zero, and electricity is a big part of that. They talk about just to decarbonize the electric grid, they suggest it's going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $5.4 billion a year that needs to be spent starting now every year up until over the next 28 years. And that we need to at least double the electric capacity in this country by 2050. Have you been made aware of any plans that have been put forward by the federal government to make sure that we are able to implement these kinds of things as we move forward?
Well, I thank the member for the question. It is indeed a challenging future that we're facing. There have been a number of studies that have attempted to give a sense of the scope and scale, anywhere between 1.2 to $2 trillion. When we're looking at doubling or tripling the electricity output in this country, it is large, it is huge, but doubling is between now and 2050 is a 3 to 4% increase each year, which is doable, except that we're not doing it yet. No, we're not real clear exactly what that is going to look like and precisely what kind of support is going to be available, but we're actively in discussions on everything from, what the investment climate may look like to the evolving clean electricity standard, the clean electricity regulation that is being developed at this stage.
Do you have any idea what electric grid capacity increase will be necessary to meet the zero-emission vehicle targets that are coming in by 2030? So we're, 7 and 4 months away from that. I would think that's going to be a large draw on the existing electricity capacity. Do you know how much that will be? Again, has the government said what their plan is to help industry get to that over the next 7 years and 4 months?
Yeah, the challenge to meet the electrification of transportation is certainly one that will be enormous over the long term. Have there been plans that have been articulated at a national level, not with respect to the grid itself, but certainly with respect to what we understand will be the pace with which electric vehicles will be coming out. The responsibility for ensuring that our transmission and distribution systems will be ready for that is not something that is at the federal level. It's something that resides with the individual companies themselves. It is also important that while we know when the target date is for all new vehicles to be electrified, that doesn't mean we will have to throw a switch on that day. Because an internal combustion engine car is going to last for 10 or 15 years. So it will be a bit of a slower rollout, but it is a rollout, at least with respect to the electricity system, that needs to be managed at the individual company level and within what effectively are 13 different electricity systems in this country.
I'm aware that the federal government doesn't have the role in actually producing electricity in the country, but if industry has to double capacity, decarbonize the grid, in order to meet these targets, someone's paying for that, correct? Like either industry is going to pay for it or government is going to help industry pay for it. If government doesn't help industry pay for that, do you have any idea what the cost of that would be to the average consumer of electricity?
Thank you for that. And it is about the individual consumer. You know, when people say it's either the government paying for it or industry paying for it, what we're saying is it's either the ratepayer or the taxpayer that's paying for it. And it's not clear where all of these costs are ultimately going to fall. It is certainly something that is foremost in the minds of the sector. We're very conscious of the pressures and the price pressures. It's also something that, we're trying to get a better sense with other stakeholders in this space. The Canadian Climate Institute has been doing modeling in this space. The Trottier Energy Futures Institute has been doing modeling in this space. It is not precisely clear what that is going to look like in the future, but it is certainly something that is top of mind when I talk to the CEOs of my member companies, the impacts on the individual customer.
So would you agree with me that the federal government has a role to make sure that all the costs of decarbonizing the electric grid and expansion of the electric grid doesn't go down to the ratepayer, the individual taxpayer? Well,
I guess the question is, the costs need to go somewhere. They will either go to the ratepayer or the taxpayer or a combination of those two. There isn't a third pocket from which one can draw. Our principal concern at this stage with respect to the energy transition is the speed with which it's taking place, and there is an important role that the Government of Canada can play. There have been announcements of projects, most recently in Labrador with the hydrogen project that we're told could be built in a period of about 2 years to build the project. But boy, to site a project and to go through all of the hoops required to get a project moving forward, we're talking a decade. A major hydroelectric project, for example, takes decades to go through all of these processes. Our net zero commitments as a country are, less than 5,000 days away. Okay. And so that's where we see the principal role for the government.
As you pointed out, hydropower uses mature, existing technology that, of course, we have been so blessed with in Manitoba. It provides, hydro provides 95%, I believe, of our electricity needs. But it's 20% in Saskatchewan and only 5% in Alberta. We've long in Manitoba talked about something we call the east-west power grid, sort of the Atlantic loop for Western Canada, if you will. We have the Birtle subdivision, which is already providing electricity to Saskatchewan to help them in their decarbonization efforts. You have Site C, which has had its share of problems. I see a knowing look from Ms. Collins, but could potentially be a source of clean power for decarbonizing Alberta. I wonder if you had any comments on that vision. Is that a project that your association is seized with? I understand one of the issues is the regulatory systems that have to be meshed and provincial rivalries, of course, and there may need to be some innovation there, to use your words. But is that the kind of thing that we need to be looking at to really scale up our efforts and meet the electricity needs that you've spoken about?
Thank the member for the question. As I noted in my comments, if we're going to meet our 2050 targets and if we're going to double to triple the electricity system in this country, we will need an all-of-the-above approach. And so transmission and greater regional transmission is absolutely going to be required for the future, but it is not the sole solution. None of these are the sole solution. Small modular reactors will be part of the future, but it's not the sole solution. Hydrogen will be part of the future. It is not the sole solution. The scope and scale of increasing our electricity 2 to 3 times is going to mean that we absolutely are going to have to rely on far greater transmission, interregional transmission, but that will be only one part of a larger solution that will need an all-of-the-above approach.
Thank you. My next question, Mr. Chair, is to Dr. Hoicka. I had the good fortune to speak to the Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Institute annual conference on Monday morning, and I was just astounded to hear that all of the technology that we need to get to net zero in buildings exists. And their major ask of government, of society, I suppose, is they need upskilling and reskilling. They need what we're calling the just transition approach for their particular sector. The building sector is responsible for 20% of greenhouse gases, and we are investing staggering amounts of money, $2.6 billion in home retrofits. There are not enough people to actually assess homes at this time. I wonder if Dr. Hoicka would have any comments on the issue of workforce developments, not only in the building sector, but also in the renewable sector, if we're going to get and achieve the kind of goals that she mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really important part of a just energy transition. This is what we hear everywhere. And I think that there are quite a few organizations in Canada that are willing and able to start to support workforce transition in this area.
Or development?
Absolutely. Well, it's a priority right now. Today, we're having challenges with ensuring that we have a sufficient workforce for the electricity system that we have currently. The skill sets are going to change in the future, and it is something that the industry very much is seized with and conscious of. I keep talking about the doubling or tripling of the electricity system, but it's also going to be a different kind of system, and there are going to be different skill sets that are going to be required for that future. So it is something that we're very much engaged with a number of our partners.
Thank you very much. My first question will be for Mr. Bradley. I think as the CEO of Electricity Canada, you and your members prioritize the production of green electricity, renewable electricity, that which is closest to carbon zero. We have written a Bloc Québécois-sponsored report to force car makers to offer a minimum number of electric vehicles. If we want people to buy them, there has to be supply. Sometimes supply is absent. In the last budget, the government committed to encouraging charging stations along main roads quickly. One of the obstacles to consumers is the lack of access to these charging stations. So my first question is, does your organization understand the federal plan for deployment of these charging stations? Were you consulted about the implementation of this deployment plan? Thank you very much for the question. Yes, indeed. Our members got involved in discussions.
Engaged in those conversations about the EV mandates since the very beginning, and we continue to engage because the process has not certainly come to a landing, and there are a great many challenges as we move forward to the future. Many of our members are now getting involved as well in electric vehicle charging infrastructure as well because of that lack of infrastructure. And we're seeing that really across the country and from coast to coast. But we have been in conversation as the EV mandates and EV discussions have been moving forward and with the Government of Canada and its strategy.
Okay. My second question, you say that you are involved. I'd like to know, first of all, how that involvement takes shape, in terms of discussions, as you mentioned, but in concrete terms when it comes to deployment. You mentioned challenges. I'd like to know more about these challenges and how to resolve them, if you have any solutions in mind.
Challenges that I'm talking about are not specific to the mandates themselves, and to the challenges that we're attempting to address are more of a technical challenges that we have with the timing of upgrades to the distribution system. So from a system standpoint, and increasingly working with customers to ensure that the kind of service that the individual customer has is appropriate for what they will require. For many customers, the current electricity service that they receive at their home is insufficient for the kind of charge that will be required if they're going to have home charging. There are a number of approaches that are being looked at. Up until now, most of this has been done by the individual customers themselves, but increasingly the industry is getting involved in these discussions because the timing of the deployment of charging infrastructure has an impact on distribution systems, and we want to make sure that we've got greater visibility in this space.
My first question is to Ms. Hoicka. I understand that according to the OECD, there are around 38 clean energy technologies that are considered market ready and could be scaled immediately. You gave some examples of those technologies that the government could be better supporting and that would make a real difference. Can you expand on why it's so important to focus on rapidly scaling up these technologies that are currently available in the near term before 2030?
Yeah, absolutely. Basically, these are technologies that are ready to go and are implementable on fairly short timescales, as long as we have really good policy and program design, which means, administrative, regulatory, economic instruments, and that type of thing. These are technologies that are proven, and so they can be implemented on a short time scale. Some other technologies that are not proven on a short time scale, for example, nuclear small modular reactors, they might be able to get to market after the 2030 timeframe, but from all of the evidence that I've seen, including from the nuclear sector itself, they are not likely to be ready immediately. And so timeframes are really important, because if we don't meet the 2030 and then the 2050 timeframe, the impacts of climate change become far more disastrous to current and future generations, and we've already been feeling that presently.
And mentioned nuclear, but what about carbon capture, utilization, and storage? Does it fall into one of these 38 categories, or does it currently show the ability to bring down emissions that we would need by 2030 to keep warming below 1.5 degrees?
Not currently, no.
Thank you. Based on your research and experience, what is the biggest barrier facing renewable energy and energy efficiency technologies in Canada?
Well, in terms of their utilization, one of the biggest barriers is lack of policy for their uptake. So we've had really, really successful policies in Canada, like feed-in tariff laws, that allowed for a lot of different types of communities and organizations to develop these. Europe is continuing this with the new energy communities and renewable energy communities laws. So that's one piece. A future issue will be around materials, because the materials that go into them are finite. But again, we can address that by putting resources through Canada's Tri-Council into research and development into materials for these types of technologies.
Thank you. Would you say the federal government has given clear, consistent policy direction that would enable investment in new infrastructure to meet the electricity needs?
I've looked at...
Oh, sorry, Ms. Hoicka. Sorry, this was directed at Mr. Bradley.
We do have clarity in some areas. we have clarity, for example, with respect to the price of carbon. And so that's one piece of the plank. What we are lacking really is clarity in some other specific areas. One area that we would like to see some clarity is we would very much like to see an articulated national strategy for electrification.
Thank you. And, thinking about the Atlantic Loop and the needed transmission lines between BC and Alberta. You had written in an article this year, unfortunately, though the federal government has been good at crafting and announcing aspirational targets and commitments, the electricity industry has been left waiting for details. In fact, during 1 week last spring, Canada had 3 different emission targets for 2030. Can you describe the impact when we need to start building, when we're running out of time, that kind of policy incoherence has?
The requirement to make investments in the order of, as was said earlier, somewhere between $1 to $2 trillion requires a level of certainty that we don't have at this stage, and that is what we're looking for. We need certainty in terms of the ability to move projects through to completion. It takes simply too long to bring projects forward and get them adopted. In that vein, one of the things, for example, if there are specific projects that we should be thinking about some way to fast track the best projects as opposed to have them all in the same queue.
Thank you so much. And back to Ms. Hoicka, can you speak a bit about the challenges facing our electricity grids, both in terms of increasing electricity demand and the threats posed by increasing extreme weather events due to the climate crisis, and any solutions that you see to those challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with the climate crisis. What we're seeing around the globe and here in Canada, I've experienced it both in Toronto and in British Columbia, is around extreme events, weather hazards due to climate change. So this could be extreme heat events requiring a lot of air conditioning. This could be events where the grid infrastructure is overheated. And so, which means that basically people are not getting the electricity that they need when they need it. In order to address this, what we really need to be thinking about is having more resilient grids, encouraging people to be prosumers, having behind the meter, having every type of resilient option possible,
okay, perfect.
Local microgrids.
Perfect, thanks very much. I will go now to the second round, Mr. Mazier, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Bradley, the energy needs of rural and northern Canada are very different than of urban Canada. Canadians who live in rural and northern regions use and pay for more energy. As someone who represents rural Canadians, I know that they are being unfairly burdened because of the government's energy and environment policies. In the association's 2022 net zero report that was prepared for your association, section 5.2 focused solely on the importance of not having a one-size-fits-all approach for energy policy in Canada. And I'm quoting here, approaches to the energy system policy, planning and regulatory reform need to be anchored in the principle of respecting difference, unquote. Can you expand on this and provide recommendations on how we can better address the unique needs of rural and remote regions when it comes to energy?
Thank the member for the question. There are different approaches that need to be taken for different circumstances. I mentioned there are 10 provincial and 3 territorial electricity systems. But to the member's point, there are significant differences in terms of the requirements for rural, remote, and Indigenous communities. We are so far pleased to see that in the at least evolving clean electricity regulation, there is a recognition that off-grid electricity will seemingly be treated different than on-grid electricity systems. So that is at least one example where we do seem to see a recognition that there is differences between the connected systems and the disconnected systems. But to your point, there is a disproportionate amount of non-renewable generation that is required in these areas, and we need to ensure that we're bringing forward policies and we're bringing forward programs to help those rural and remote communities.
Are independent power producers considered in that mix? And when you were talking about off-grid, always been of the thought, especially when you get into the rural areas, the distribution grid is under some tremendous challenges of the utilities are trying to get that power out to those rural areas. Has there been any more discussion amongst the utilities across Canada of some kind of plan of how they're going to deal with independent power producers to achieve these goals? Like, is there any policy changing happening to address?
Within our association, we have both the incumbent utility companies and the largest independent power producers. So they are members of our association, and so they are also active participants in the discussions that take place around the boardroom table between the CEOs about the policies for the electricity sector writ large. So we're not the Association of Electric Utilities. We're the association of the people, all of the companies that are generating, transmitting, distributing electricity. So those views are part and parcel of what we bring forward.
Is there any concern of the decentralization of the electrical grid as we expand so much? And then that spells trouble for reliability. Like, where's that conversation happening?
Wow, what a terrific question. I think what we're seeing, and we're going to continue to see, is two forces happening at the same time. And so, both expansion and contraction taking place at the same time. To be able to meet those long-term targets that we have with respect to greenhouse gas emissions, we're going to have to significantly increase our grid connected and grid level power, but we're also going to have to massively ramp up what happens at the individual consumer level, at the community level. We're going to be seeing customers themselves becoming increasingly producers and part and parcel of this market. So we're going to see the grid itself expand, but we're also going to see the role of individual consumers and distributed energy resources and community level resources expand. So all of those are going to be happening at the same time.
Okay, and there are many rural and remote communities that are having difficulty just accessing electricity or enough electricity. There's a company in my riding who's starting a greenhouse and to grow tomatoes locally, and one of the main challenges they're facing is before they begin construction is sourcing the electricity to operate, and which is rising not only their electrical costs but also their operational costs to even get started. So how important is access to affordable energy for economic growth in Canada?
I think we have to go to Mr. Weiler now. We're out of
Dr. Hoicka, you mentioned that there are gaps in terms of the areas where Canada should move on better supporting clean tech deployment. Canada to this point has accelerated capital cost allowance for business investment in clean energy equipment, a 50% reduction in corporate income tax for manufacturers of net zero emissions technologies, and in the budget this year we announced an investment tax credit of up to 30% for clean tech. From your point of view, where does the government have to go further than these particular tax measures?
Yeah, thanks for summarizing that, and thank you for the question. Those tax measures to me appear to be more on incubating and accelerating technology. Is that correct?
They're investment tax credits.
Okay. So where I would say that there needs to be more support, there's different stages of technology diffusion. One of the areas where technology tends to get really stuck is in the diffusion stage, which means making it into markets and making it into communities. And so what we need are basically market pull type regulatory and economic instruments and administrative supports. And I would say that Canada can uptake those. Another piece is that you can also do targeted research support. So for example, as I mentioned, targeting things like technology that will address congestion in cities, which is where most of the energy growth and electricity growth will go. That's a big piece. You can also target around materials for different types of clean technologies in terms of that their finite resources. And you can target for things like, say, wind turbines in Arctic areas.
In the past decades, we've seen a number of buildings and houses that were LEED certified. However, this is not an obligatory standard. Now there are cement buildings that have no energy plus value. What incentives would encourage the building of energy efficient buildings that even produce energy in some cases? My second question is, should we look at our urban planning models in order to adopt ones that have significant positive impacts, not just to preserve our environment, but in terms of the use and production of energy? What should be taken into account through the implementation of such models?
This is a really good question, and those are absolutely what we should be thinking about and where we should be going. So addressing climate change and energy use at the urban scale is a really critical lever that we have. So for example, having waste heat capture and usage on the neighborhood scale, that would be a really, really great way to reduce waste heat, and also then to use waste heat and reduce fossil fuel emissions. Getting people out of cars and into public transit, walking on cycle lanes, those types of things will also dramatically reduce energy used. In terms of buildings, most of our buildings are already built. So what I have argued for in the past is to have innovative business models, to put the innovation into the business model around clusters of technology that can retrofit buildings, and to focus on convenience, and also to focus on cost and making sure that we reach the widest population possible. In terms of new buildings, I would again say innovative business models in terms of the targets that you wish to reach. But all of those are really critical going forward, because this has to do with equity issues, it has to do with comfort, and it has to do with climate change.
To Ms. Hoicka, how big a role does energy conservation and energy efficiency have to play?
A very big role, as big as we can get it.
Can you speak a little bit more about deep building retrofits, kind of what we need to do when it comes to energy efficiency, but also on the conservation side?
Yeah, so a deep building retrofit can bring down energy use in a building by 50 to 80%, whereas a regular retrofit where we're not thinking in terms of systems is only 20 to 30%. So if we focus on the method by which we do it, we can get those really deep reductions. And that's how we're really going to support populations, households, businesses in terms of this energy transition and concerns around any rising costs, for example, the inflation that we're experiencing right now. So that's a very protective aspect. It also will improve comfort and resilience to building occupants. And as I said, the technology is out there, but really the innovation needs to be around how do we have business models that go out that address labor, that address investment, that address convenience, because a lot of these types of renovations are not convenient for people.
Thank you. And when it comes to support for deployment of renewable energy, how would you say Canada compares on the international stage? And are there specific examples of countries that you think that we should be looking at?
Yes. So Canada, what did pretty well with the feed-in tariffs, but then a lot of those programs were canceled, and a lot of the contracts were canceled, which is unfortunate. A few places that are really leading. Vietnam had one of the most rapid uptakes of renewable energy, starting with solar photovoltaic and then wind. And this was because of the alignment of a whole range of regulatory, economic, and knowledge support incentives. They had the most rapid uptake of renewable energy, I think, ever seen in a really short period of time. The European Union is now moving forward with our new understanding of grid distribution by looking at something called renewable energy communities and energy communities. And this is really looking at things like microgrids, virtual power plants, and clustering of tech in different.
A energy corridor from Manitoba back over to Alberta. Perhaps if we could get one from Alberta all the way to the East Coast and to the West Coast so that we can replace some conflict oil, and help our economy so that we have the money available to develop new resources and new resource concepts as we've been talking about. On a more serious point, Mr. Bradley, the question on charging stations. From Edmonton to Calgary, Tesla last winter when it was minus 40 made it halfway on a full charge. And it had to stop. It couldn't charge outside. It had to go inside in order to charge enough to make it the rest of the way. There is a long ways to go in order to get to the stage where consumers that don't live in a city are going to say, maybe this is something that we might try and might consider. However, it does look when a government puts a full blanket ban that simply says, no, that's got to be it, we're not going to sell anymore. There's a bit of a concern and issues that are there. And of course, I guess when we talk about electricity, and you would be the one that could tie into this, you're the distributor of electricity. I'm just wondering if you could supply us with the full life cycle costs of each of the energy sources that we plan on using in the future and compare it to those energy sources that we presently use. Because in 15, 20 years, we're going to be replacing all the windmills, we're going to be replacing all the solar panels, we're going to have to be dealing with that type of technology changes. We have issues as far as oil and gas is concerned, as far as nuclear is concerned, as far as building dams is concerned. Who is it that looks at the amount of energy that is used to implement and produce each and every one of these energy sources that we either have or plan on having in the future?
Thank you for the question. Those kinds of determinations are made in each of the jurisdictions, and each jurisdiction has a different approach to it. Some provinces have integrated resource planning processes. Some provinces have an independent system operator that is charged with undertaking those sorts of studies. Yes, the life and the life cycle of some of these generation sources we don't know yet. And we are going to, indeed, we're going to have to see. We're used to building technology that lasts for decades and decades. In the case of some of our hydro plants, we've got hydro plants that were built in the late 1800s on the Niagara River that are still operational today. Now they've been upgraded. And they continue to be upgraded on an ongoing basis. But we don't know at this stage if that is going to be the future of wind generation. If what will occur in wind generation will be changing out of some of the parts, or the same is true with other new generation sources as well. We just don't know yet. We don't have enough experience. But there are responsibilities in every jurisdiction to undertake those studies and make those determinations.
About the electrical grid and being able to get energy from Canada around the world. We see what is happening in Europe right now, where their industrial heartland is completely being undermined by the fact that they just need to make sure they've got enough electricity to keep their people going for the winter. That is the biggest concern. So unless we're prepared to look at all possibilities and to use that which we have, which in Canada is an energy source that the whole world is still using. I really think it's important that we try to find the right mix so that eventually we are able to help fund those, the renewable or the non-renewable, the renewable energy sources.
We've had a lot of testimony today around the complex nature of electrical distribution, provinces and territories, Indigenous communities, all have standards that they operate under. The federal government has some role to play and could play in terms of harmonizing some of the standards, but then it needs approval by the provinces and territories. This Cleantech study that we're working on has electricity as one of the key areas that Canada could advance clean technologies. Things like combined heat and power that's operating in Japan, or the ENVI program in Germany that's operating successfully. We have some challenges constitutionally. Could you maybe talk about how your industry is trying to bridge some of the challenges that we face to harmonize?
Yes, thank you for the question. As a representative of a national association, essentially representing an industry that is principally provincial based, this is what we do. We spend the bulk of our time trying to bridge those divides. We've been, as a country, we've been successful in the past at having federal and provincial cooperation in areas that are principally provincial responsibility. We've been, as a country, quite successful on some of these endeavors in the past. If you look at the challenge that we're facing to get to net zero by 2050 as an economy, this challenge is probably as great as it was when we wanted to introduce universal health care. And we should be thinking of it in those kinds of terms, in terms of requiring that kind of an effort.
I think we see that through carbon pricing and the disagreements with the provinces, even going all the way to the Supreme Court to try and fight over jurisdiction on that. So I think maybe if you have any other comment about what we could include in our report in terms of the importance of Canada working together on this, and then I'll turn my time back to the chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Longfield.
If he has something to say.
Oh, sorry, yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
We will provide, if we have additional comments, we'll provide them in writing. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to both witnesses for your very clear and definitive expert